It's time for another Guess the Injury challenge, where I walk through an injury and describe what I'm seeing, and then you try and test your knowledge to see if we come to the same conclusion. Today we're going to be talking about this unfortunate left lower limb injury sustained during a grappling event. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and if you're new here and enjoy learning about the underlying anatomy and mechanisms of different sports injuries, then please consider subscribing to support the channel and stay up to date with all my videos. You guys really enjoyed the first one of these I did, so time for number 2. I'm going to play this clip through a couple of times with the sound just to get a real-time speed view of what happened here. You can obviously see the moment where something was injured here. We can hear that very audible snap or pop. But winding this up, again, I want you to think with these different sports injury mechanisms where different forces and torques are being applied to the joints and to the bones. The competitor who's down here is trying to force this submission, and to do so, he's pulling down on his left heel and ankle and kind of doing this bridge where he's going to be raising his trunk up a little bit, activating his glutes while pulling down on his ankle. His competitor has his knee on the inside of his thigh, which is going to make this anchor point and a fulcrum where there's going to be torques and pressures applied on either side of that fulcrum, right? If we think about just a lever system with a fulcrum in the middle, like a seesaw, if you push down on one end of that lever, there's going to be a resultant force on the other end, creating a torque. So here, as he's pulling down, there's going to be some posteriorly directed force this way as his knee pulls down this way, with his competitor's head basically serving as the anchor point or the fulcrum of that seesaw, so to speak, in the middle. The moment just before we hear that pop, there's kind of this last little bridge up attempt that's going to briefly increase that force that's being transmitted kind of through that lever system before ultimately we see some structure fail. I also noticed that his competitor appears to be pulling on his thigh with his hand this way, and this whole sort of system of where the pulling is occurring at the ankle is also going to introduce some twisting through that hip, through the femur, through the knee, as he pulls down. So what I'm seeing is some posterior directed force this way. I'm seeing a rotational component applied through the thigh, through the leg, and then ultimately, of course, that pop. So let me know down below what you think happened here. Remember, at both ends of that fulcrum, you have a joint. On one end, you have the hip joint. On the other end, you have the knee joint. And also remember that bones don't like being twisted. They do really well in compression, but they don't like being torqued or twisted. So all those things considered, what do you think happened? If you said a fracture of his femur, specifically a spiral fracture of the femoral shaft, then we're in agreement. Of course, there's no way to know exactly what happened here, so again, we're just trying to see if we both agree based on injury mechanisms. With our bidigital anatomy tool here, I've shown basically all of the lower limb, again, starting up at the hip joint, down to the knee joint, to the ankle. What I want you to remember is I said bones do really well in compression when we squeeze them, right? Because we're walking, we're weight bearing. Our bones are made to absorb load when we're compressing them. That means load coming down this way and load coming up this way. You can see how that ends up producing this natural curvature to the femur sort of in this direction. And that's again to help absorb that compressive load. But our bones are not very strong whenever we start talking about twisting them or torquing them in this spiral direction. Pulling in our triple box here, remember in this position, this leg is going to be crossed up over, and because he's pulling down on his ankle up this direction, the opponent's head is right here creating this fulcrum or this anchor point. What's going to happen is you're going to get this combination of twisting forces of torques applied through the thigh. His pelvis is relatively anchored down while the end of that whole limb is being torqued and twisted. What I believe that's going to do is then impart this torsional force through the femur, and remember, bones are not very good at holding up that twisting force. For anybody who said a tibia injury or a knee injury, I don't see anything in the tibia or the shin here. It's possible there was some trauma to the knee, but nothing that we could clearly delineate. And if we really kind of take this through frame by frame, you can really see the moment when that spiral fracture likely occurred. One other thing I was thinking of here was a hip dislocation, because remember, there's going to be this force posterior at the hip. And oftentimes when hips dislocate, they dislocate with the ball of the hip popping out the backside. But when we really look at it kind of frame by frame, you can see how the leg sort of shifts downward, kind of higher up, rather than the portion of the back of the hip popping down right away. So if it would have been a hip dislocation, I would have expected we'd see this entire lower leg or the entire thigh component sort of shift backwards, but we really initially just see this distal or the lower end of what I think is the fracture segment shift down before kind of giving way completely. Femur fractures are often something we only see in like motor vehicle accidents or high energy collisions, not very common in sports. And so when we do see concern for one, you always wonder about underlying integrity of the bone. Was there some issue with the bone health that made it weaker to where it couldn't sustain forces that typically a femur could? You also wonder about things like stress fractures to the bone that again might introduce a site of weakness for a fracture to occur. Again, I think the key learning points from this one are that bones don't do well under twisting or torque. Remember that also when you have anchor points from body contact with a competitor, that's going to act as a fulcrum where you're going to have torques on either end, kind of like when you think of sitting on a seesaw. When you're looking at these things, we think about how that force is going to be applied at each of those ends. In this case, there is a hip joint and a knee joint at either end, and a twisting component going through that seesaw that I think ultimately led to the femur failing and breaking. Let me know down below if we agreed in our assessment. And again, any comments are appreciated on this sort of video style if you like it, if you have other injuries you want me to take a look at, as I do future Guess the Injury challenges. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.